Before 9/11, few Westerners had heard of Wahhabism. Today, it's a household word everywhere. It has been frequently mentioned in connection with Osama bin Laden, the man apparently behind the 9/11 attacks on New York. Wahhabism is portrayed by the media and public officials as an intolerant, puritanical, militant interpretation of Islam, calling for the destruction of the West through a jihad of global proportions. On the other hand, I hear a very radically different view from some Muslims I know who say that the founder of this movement, and I'll come to him in a second, he was a reformer who was against extremism and simply sought to revive the religion of Islam by going back to the Quran and the Sunnah, and was far from being the extremist portrayed by many, including many in the Muslim world. So what are we to make of these radically different interpretations? Now, I don't have any definitive answers, so I turn to the scholarly literature, the academic work, for a more objective view to see what's really going on. This book called Wahhabi Islam is very good, From Revival and Reform to Global Jihad, by an American scholar, Natana Delong-Bas. Now, she is a professor at Boston College and a very distinguished scholar. If you look at her publications list on the university website, it goes on for pages and pages. For example, she is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Women. And this particular volume won a major publishing award. This particular book we're looking at on Wahhabi Islam was named one of the 5 best books for understanding Islam by the Wall Street Journal, of all things. She's co-authored many other works as well, so she is a specialist in this area, and the academic reviews on the back are very, very positive as well. So this is a good book. She's not a Muslim, but she has a specialist interest in what the founder of Wahhabism actually said by examining his writings in detail and extensively, also within the historical context. So she seems to be a good guide, and I invite you to read her work if you want to pursue this further. The book itself claims to be the first study ever undertaken in the West of Wahhabism's founder, who goes by the name of Muhammad ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab, who was born in 1702 in what is today called Saudi Arabia. And he formed an alliance with a man called Saud, and this founded basically the Saudi dynasty, which still exists today, where you have the ulama, the Islamic scholars, successors, literally descended from al-Wahhab, and the Saudis, the rulers, and together they govern Saudi, what we call Saudi Arabia. Now, in the opinion of this academic, she shatters the stereotypes and misconceptions that many people in the West have about this founder. And her reading produces a revisionist thesis that Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab was not the godfather of terrorist movements. On the contrary, he was a voice of reform, reflecting mainstream 18th century Islamic thought. And his vision of Islamic society was based upon monotheism, this is Tawheed in Arabic, in which Muslims, Christians and Jews were to enjoy peaceful coexistence and cooperate in commercial and treaty relations. Also, because the author of this book has a particular interest in Islam and women. In her view, al-Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism, was a strong proponent of women's rights. Yes, you heard that right. Calling for a balance of rights between women and men, both within marriage and with access to education and the public space. Now, certainly for myself, the stereotype that we hear of Wahhabis, believing that women should be completely covered with a burqa, no access to education, basically slaves of their husbands, property, basically, of the men. And so I'm relieved to turn to this work to find out that's not true. to put it mildly. I just want to read a short extract from the conclusion. So this summarizes at the end of the book her findings through an extensive reading of all the original texts in their historical context. And she concludes, and I invite you to make your own mind up, of course, because I'm far from being an expert and I'm just trying to give another view of this founder's thought. She says on page 284, Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab's rejection of literalism, which she discusses in detail earlier, in favour of the recognition of broad Quranic values is nowhere more apparent than his teachings about women and the construction of gender. This is a key issue for this author. His vision of gender balance defies the standard stereotypes of Wahhabis as misogynists by placing women on a balanced footing with men. She continues, Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab wrote extensively on the topics of marriage and divorce and the woman's place within those transactions. Rather than excluding her from the process as simply a party to be bargained for and sold, Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab recognized the right of a woman to participate throughout the process of contracting and negotiating the marriage. Now, that's quite a shocking revelation. Although he did not permit women to carry out the administrative drafting of the marriage contract, he insisted that they be allowed to propose prospective husbands, so that women could suggest that husbands, stipulate favourable conditions in the marriage contract, such as limitations on polygamy and situations that would result in divorce, that she would receive her dower in full as her own property to manage, and be paid maintenance for the duration of the marriage. He further required that women's consent to the marriage be required in order for it to be recognised as valid. So women clearly had a very substantial role in the whole marriage and divorce and inheritance and dowry process. So the author here goes on, Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab's writings make clear that his broad respect for and protection of women. Recognizing a woman's vulnerability, he not only sought to grant her power in matters directly related to her family status, marriage, divorce, childbearing and inheritance, but also in the most personal of matters, sexual relations. It's extraordinary, by the way, how the intimate details of marriage are discussed here. And this is quite revealing as to this Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab's view of marital relations. On the one hand, she writes, the author, he assured women that they, as well as men, were entitled to sexual relations and satisfaction in their marital lives. He underlined the importance of respecting a woman with whom one is engaged in sexual relations by protecting her right to privacy in the marriage bed, as well as making even the most intimate matters of sexual intercourse a matter of negotiation between a husband and wife, rather than a position in which the man was all-powerful. So how delicate is that? How delicate and civilized is that? Further, he insisted that husbands treat their wives respectfully and with dignity, and forbade husbands to beat their wives. Now, the next section goes on about how Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab sought to protect women from male sexual aggression, condemning rape and so on. It's fascinating. I'm not going to go into that. You can read that yourself, of course. Moving on to looking now at converting other people to Islam and the question of jihad. In Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab's vision, education and debate were the preferred methods of gaining adherents. So something called dawah in Islam, where you share knowledge about Islam and you invite people to embrace Islam. The stereotype would be that you do jihad and you force people at the point of a sword to accept Islam or die, that kind of stereotype. But according to our author here, al-Wahhab's vision of doing dawah was via debate and education. she says. Thus, education was to be an integral part even of jihad as holy war. He did not support a convert or die mentality or encourage conversions at sword point, because he recognized a true conversion to Islam must come from the heart and mind, rather than as an expedient alternative to the threat of immediate death. So the intention is what really matters. And this goes back to a very famous hadith, where the niyat, the intention, is what matters in one's actions. Because one can do the right thing for the wrong reason or have ulterior motives. So for this writer, and I've read this elsewhere in the book, al-Wahhabs stress intention and the purpose of doing things rather than a legalistic framework. Consequently, she continues, he did not insist on conquering towns or villages by military action first, with only a perfunctory attempt at education afterward, but rather he engaged in a letter-writing campaign and sending of missionaries, often over extended periods of time, in order to try and peacefully gain adherents through persuasion rather than coercion. The conversion of the towns of Washim and Riyadh famously in Saudi Arabia, are representative of these attempts. So shockingly, letter-writing campaigns, this was the extent of wow, that's very, very moderate. And lastly, jihad itself. What about jihad itself? Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab's vision of jihad was purely defensive in nature. This is on page 288 of this volume. He legitimated jihad only in cases in which Muslims had experienced actual aggression. Interesting. He did not glorify martyrdom because he believed that the only intent a person should have in carrying out jihad was defense of God and God's community, not the desire for personal rewards or glory, whether on earth or in the afterlife. Furthermore, Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab did not permit the use of jihad in aggressive activity directed against others. By limiting jihad to cases that were strictly defensive in nature, he precluded the possibility of using it as a means of consolidating political power or forcibly spreading Wahhabi rule on a religious basis. Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab's teaching on jihad, she writes, stands in marked contrast to contemporary fundamentalists, most notably Osama bin Laden, although it is often posited that bin Laden's ideology of global jihad has its origins in Ibn Abu Wahhab's writings, because both are Wahhabis. The reality is that bin Laden's ideology owes far more to the writings of a chap called Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is an Egyptian who was executed in the 1960s. And she's saying that Osama bin Laden owes far more to Sayyid Qutb than to the writings of Ibn ʿAbd al-Wahhab. So what else? So I think that's probably enough. So I haven't read it all, but I know from this thick tome she really combs through the writings. She's very sensitive, particularly to issues of gender and the status of women and violent jihad. According to her, there couldn't be a greater difference between the revival, as it says there, between the founder of Wahhabism and the later twisting and perversion of the founder's ideology, which is not really his ideology at all, actually. It comes from other sources. So there we are. That's just one view, but it is a view that's very scholarly and has received wide acceptance in academic circles. Sadly, it seems these facts are little known outside of an elite Western ivory tower, although they are now increasingly amongst Salafi Muslims who, in my experience, the Salafis I know certainly do embody those more mainstream revival attitudes of persuasion and conversation and missionary work, and against takfiri and against violent jihad. They seem to be following in their founder's footsteps quite faithfully. And of course, Wahhab himself simply argued that he was following the example of Muhammad. And this is a point that is constantly stressed in here, that he constantly looked back to Prophet Muhammad, his sunnah, his example, his practice, his teaching, the hadith, the seerah, and the Quran, of course, to revive Islam, to inspire it in a new and fresh way for the contemporary world. Now, I know what I've said is very controversial, and I'm far from being an expert, and there are many distinguished Muslims and scholars who would very strongly reject his thought, and that is way above my pay grade. My purpose here is simply to share with you some reputable academic Western work on this understanding of Islam, and to show that actually very different interpretations of his life and thought are held by responsible Western scholars as well as contemporary Salafis who follow mainstream Salafism. Until next time.